with Mr. Gene Nichol for his book, Indecent Assembly. And I'm trying to show this to you in front of our virtual background. And so I keep fading in and out. But this is a book about the legislature. And just to tell you a little something, I'm just going to share something from you, read a little bit from some early praise from John Grisham. And I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs on this because I think is this in a nutshell, what we've been going through for the last, 12 years now, 10 years, something like that. But anyway, back in the 1980s, I had the privilege of serving two terms. I had the privilege of serving 2 terms in the Mississippi House of Representatives. In those days, and for decades before, the state of North Carolina was the unquestioned leader of modern reforms in the South. And that's one of the main reasons why actually my family moved down here from New Hampshire. My dad got a new job, and my mom was like, it has to have a good school system. And if it didn't have a good school system, they were going to get a divorce. So luckily they had a good school system and we came down here. But anyway, in those days and for decades before, the state of North Carolina was the unquestioned leader of modern reforms in the South. It was viewed by us and by legislatures from other states as the model of a sensible, workable state government that got things done and tried to take care of its more vulnerable citizens. Those days are gone. In 2013, hardcore conservative Republicans won big and put together supermajorities in both the House and Senate. With a like-minded leader in the governor's office, they immediately waged war against teachers and schools, the poor, women, elections, the courts, the environment, and those with darker skin. And look where it's gotten us. You know, this year, voting is so important. This is an issue that needs to be listened to. It needs to be heard. And we have Gene Nichols, the perfect person to get it out there. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to say a little bit about Mr. Nichols himself. He is a law professor, editorial commentator, and the author of The Faces of Poverty in North Carolina, Stories from Our Invisible Citizens, and a couple of other books. He is the Boyd Tinsley Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina and writes commentary for the Raleigh News and Observer, Charlotte Observer, The Progressive Populist, and others. Thank you, Mr. Nichols. Thank you for your patience. Thank everybody who's tuning in for their patience. It's all yours, my friend.
All right. Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm glad to be patient. I understand nothing about technology, so it's always a marvel to me if the machines even come on. So I appreciate everyone's sticking with it. It's a testament to, I think, the way folks feel about the circumstance we are in. I'm going to talk about this book for a while. I wanted to, I am a big fan of McIntyre's. I wish that we could all be there. I was thinking a couple years ago, we did one of these with Hal Crowther at McIntyre's, and it was one of the nicest events I can remember. So I look forward to being back in the building myself. I want to apologize to my hair's a little out of control. I haven't cut it in a long time, and it's hard to tell what to do about that. My wife wanted me to let it go for a while, and then when I let it go for a while, she decided she wasn't much for taking the scissors to it. So I'll work it out. I know I always sort of need a haircut, but I really need one now. I want to, before I start, yesterday was a remarkable day in American history. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is one of my powerful heroes. Like a lot of y'all, I am much saddened by her passing. I just wanted to remind us of her borrowed quote. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off of our necks. That could be said as a prelude to the work of the North Carolina legislature as well. So maybe that's where we could begin. The broad frame of the story I deal with in Indecent Assembly has been told well and pervasively. John Grisham tells some of it. North Carolina, sort of once considered a beacon of farsightedness in the South and a paragon of Southern moderation, as it was said, has since 2011, but especially since 2013, undergone a powerful Republican revolution. A state long dominated by business-minded moderate Democrats has been politically turned upside down. The complex stew resulting from the rise of an assertive Tea Party, the weakening of a sometimes corruption-plagued Democratic Party, the massive investments of right-wing political donors, and an ascendant and powerful backlash against the election of Barack Obama led to a Republican takeover of both houses of the General Assembly in the 2010 election. For 2 years, Democratic Governor Bev Perdue acted as a modest counterweight to the boldest Republican ambitions. But Pat McCrory won the governor's race in 2012, giving Republicans an uncontestable control over all three branches of government for the first time since 1870. The grip included veto-proof majorities in both houses. McCrory was quick to prove that he was no match for legislative leaders, even if he ever wanted to be, and the lawmakers were not about to sit on their hands. So a cascade of changes rapidly came: strict voter regulations aimed at curtailing turnout, repeal of the Racial Justice Act, new and generous school voucher programs, potent and demeaning abortion restrictions, expansive new gun rights, attacks on teacher tenure and representation, dramatic cuts to K-12 and higher education budgets, business-friendly, in quotes, environmental regulations, internationally derided anti-LGBT measures, brutal cuts to an array of social programs to assist the poor, consistent opposition to Obamacare and Medicaid expansion, the largest cut to a state unemployment compensation program in American history, massive tax breaks for the wealthiest Tar Heels, accompanied by tax increases for low-income workers. The whole package was safeguarded by the most aggressive racial and political gerrymandering crusades ever witnessed in the United States, direct and relentless attacks on the independence of the North Carolina courts, rarely before seen intrusions on local government prerogative, violations of long established boundaries of separation of powers, and fulsome attacks on democracy itself. Powerful Senate leader Ralph Hayes would accurately brag that the Republican General Assembly had, by 2016, quote, amassed the most conservative record of any state legislature in America. The dean of North Carolina political columnists, Rob Christensen, wrote that there has been a bigger and quicker shift to the right here than in any state in the country. The New York Times referred to North Carolina's pioneering work in bigotry, as they put it. The Washington Post said our General Assembly had turned back 50 years of progress on civil rights and gutted the social safety net. Other states began to follow what was overtly deemed, quote, the North Carolina playbook, and the New York Times Magazine frantically asked, in a now Trump-based era, is North Carolina the future of American politics? So that's my starting point. In a very brief period, really just 4 or 5 years, North Carolina moved from a, quote, beacon of Southern progress to what national newspapers now readily call a laboratory for extremism, a poster child for regressive conservative policies. Second, just to remind, North Carolina citizens did not sit idly by as their state government was brutally recast. A massive Moral Monday protest movement was launched, and executed in response, following the creation of a potent and active HK-on-J coalition by the Reverend William J. Barber and the NAACP, which had started much earlier in 2007. Moral Monday leaders started weekly protests at the State House in April 2013. That day, Reverend Barber and 16 others were arrested for peacefully challenging the unfolding Republican legislative crusade, defying what Barber called regressivism on steroids. Soon, thousands joined the ranks week after week, gathering in huge throngs in Raleigh and across North Carolina. February 2014, Moral Monday drew more than 100,000 people to the steps of the legislative building, making it the largest racial justice rally in the South since the Selma to Montgomery March of 1965. Republican leaders called the multiracial protesters outside agitators, old hippies, and morons, echoing the responses of 1960 Southern segregationists. By 2014, more than 1,000 people had been arrested at State House protests. Barber told demonstrators, "We can no longer allow the ultra-conservatives to have the moral microphone. If you're going to change the nation, you've got to change the South. And if you're going to change the South, you got to focus on these legislatures." Moral Monday didn't drive Republicans from control of the General Assembly, but it had potent impact in North Carolina and beyond. First, the protests worked to thwart and slow the unimpeded reign of the legislature. Republican leaders sought to enact dramatic economic, legal, and social change without significant pushback or debate. Democratic lawmakers were powerless to contest the cascade. If Republicans aimed to remake North Carolina without troubling controversy, the protests made that impossible. They also revitalized the state Democratic Party. Barber made sure that Moral Mondays remained a moral rather than a partisan crusade. But as Democratic pollster Tom Jensen put it, Barber really stepped in to fill the void of progressive leadership for Democrats when they'd been put completely in the wilderness. Thanks largely to the demonstrations, McCrory's approval ratings dropped notably. He had won by 12 points in 2012, but by the end of the next summer, his approval ratings were decidedly underwater. Democrat Roy Cooper narrowly beat McCrory in 2016. He wouldn't have done so without the emotionally charged and pervasively visible protest. Democrats regained enough seats in 2018 to eliminate the Republican supermajorities dominating both houses. The same could be said, I think, of those campaigns. They wouldn't have been successful without Moral Monday. Cranky Republican leaders complained the Moral Monday crowd gave Democratic voters a reason to be excited, to be active, and to vote. Maybe most important, the Moral Monday protests helped convince North Carolina and later the country at large that an invigorated engagement in the democratic process provides the surest basis to secure the society that they hope to achieve. All that said, Republicans still held significant majorities in both houses of the General Assembly after the 2018 elections. Today, they enjoy a 66 to 55 edge in the House and a 29 to 21 lead in the Senate. The laws of North Carolina are still launched from these Republican caucuses in each chamber, and Republican lawmakers retain the distorted security of grotesquely gerrymandered electoral districts. On occasion now, the products of Republican lawmakers can be constrained by a bolstered gubernatorial veto power. But the North Carolina General Assembly remains, first to last, a Republican outfit, following the same destructive agenda it has pursued for the last 9 years, an agenda that has inflicted potent damage on the people of North Carolina and that directly threatens our children's future That agenda is the focus of this book. I concentrate on the legislative record of the Republican General Assembly for two reasons. The first is simple, though much has been written concerning particular legislative programs and areas of focus for Republican lawmakers. Little study seeks to examine the agenda of the General Assembly more broadly. It's one thing to read of day-by-day accretions and extensions. No doubt those alone can spark outrage. But it's another matter to seek a decade's accumulation all laid out in a package. When I began studying the General Assembly's record, I was, it's probably fair to say, a member of the determined, perhaps even angered opposition. Studying the lawmakers' work as a whole, though, can readily move one past that comparatively less alarmed state. As my friend, historian Dan Carter says, whenever he's asked if what's happening in North Carolina is as bad as it looks, it's worse, he says. It's a whole lot worse than anybody thinks. My second reason is more important, maybe. It has to do with the nature of the General Assembly's crusade, the categories and themes and beachheads of their assault, what they repeatedly show they are out to accomplish. Characterizations of the work product of the North Carolina legislature typically run along the traditional headings of punditry, liberal conservative, left right, moderate radical, and the like. And there is some accuracy in those labels, but they can also miss the basics, the defining, undergirding essentials. I argue that since 2011, the North Carolina General Assembly has waged the stoutest war against people of color and low-income citizens seen in the United States in a half century. All white Republican caucuses, dominating both houses, have behaved essentially like a white people's party, attacking the participatory rights and the anti-discrimination guarantees, and educational opportunities and equal dignities of African Americans. Poor Tar Heels have been similarly targeted, demonized, shamed, economically penalized, essentially treated as outcasts to the Commonwealth. In the process, the General Assembly has acted as a reverse Robin Hood, using the power of government to restrict the resources, opportunities, and life chances of the poor in order to bestow unneeded largesse on the rich. Women have been repeatedly denied equal dignity in reproductive decisions in ways that effectively deny their full and functioning humanity in favor of a patronizing and authoritarian state decision maker, enforcing its own vision of a meaningful life on diminished subjects. The General Assembly has also moved to officially disparage and debilitate and demean lesbian, gay, and transgender Tar Heels, to brand them as strangers, denying their membership and endangering their prospects. Public education and the environment have experienced similar insider-outsider demarcations, favoring the powerful at the expense of the marginalized and the burdened, and directly attacking notions of public obligation and a public good. These bold and singular steps can be accurately characterized as ultra-conservative and extreme, but foundationally they represent something more, a broad, animating war on equality, seeking to undo much of the mandate of the modern Equal Protection Clause. They constitute an overarching attack on the 14th Amendment itself, the most consequential provision of the United States Constitution, and they should be seen as exactly that. The Civil War Amendment's principal author said, and I quote, that he sought to assure equal justice for any person, no matter whence he comes or how poor, how weak, how simple, how friendless. The North Carolina General Assembly's actions constitute a bold and unrelenting crusade against that defining ideal. And the Republican lawmakers have not stopped there. They haven't been satisfied with powerful and sustained alterations of our substantive legal regimes, the rights and duties of Tar Heels. They've also attacked the foundations of American constitutional government: independent judicial review, separation of powers, the rule of law, and the operational values of democracy itself. The General Assembly has interfered with the judicial election process, limited judicial review of legislative acts, manipulated the size of the Court of Appeals for partisan purposes, aided Republican candidates in Supreme Court races, interfered with gubernatorial appointment powers, threatened disobedient judges with shortened terms, canceled judicial primaries, gerrymandered the districts of disfavored judges, and more. The entire state judiciary is literally under assault. Republicans have also used legislative powers more ruthlessly than any other state assembly to tilt the democratic process in their direction. They passed the most aggressive voter suppression and political gerrymandering plans seen in a half century. They've specialized in sore loser laws, overturning the results of local elections when unhappy with the choices of the voters. They've even been willing to cast aside democracy's most foundational rule: if you lose an election, you respect the will of the voters and you move on. Our General Assembly chose instead to dramatically diminish the authorities of the governor and the attorney general's offices when their favored candidates didn't prevail. No need to turn the keys of the governor's mansion over to one's successor, the theory goes. Just burn it down. Democratic norms are apparently for losers. All that matters is power. Finally, in an effort to conceal their crusade against equality and democracy, the General Assembly has repeatedly and unapologetically abandoned truth itself. Now, that's not my opinion or just my opinion, but it's been the frequent, explicit, and determined finding of state and federal courts. Lying about legislative motivation defeats the possibility of deliberative discourse and demands that reviewing courts label our lawmakers as effective perjurers. It reveals an inexcusable cynicism about democratic power and an absence of character so potent that it marks them as unfit for office. It's possible to characterize these assaults on equality and democracy and judicial review as radical and extreme, or I guess even as ultra-conservative, which is probably what the Republicans think. But the General Assembly's war on equality and its demolition of democratic and constitutional norms is actually a rejection of the structures and the foundational premises of the American experiment itself. These power-grabbing moves don't reflect the normal give and take of traditional politics. They challenge the foundations, the fundaments of our premises of government. I've long been taken with that word, fundaments. It means, broadly speaking, the basic principle, the underlying foundation or theory of a system. But it can also suggest a base or a foundation, especially of a building, the fundaments upon which we have built. Foundations of governance like judicial independence and the rule of law and separation of powers have literally taken us centuries to develop and to secure. Casting them out in a temporary craving for power mocks our history and the bold legacy of our forebears. It sells our meaning and sacrifice for an ill-intentioned mess of pottage. It breaks the most important promises we have made to one another as a people. It ought to be deemed beyond the aspiration of even a power-hungry legislature. A rejection of our fundaments is a more serious business than merely being careless or mistaken or hyperzealous or simply wrong. It's more scornful of our history, our meaning. It assumes that all that matters is the temporary authority of a favored partisan grouping, not the norms that define us as a people. It is, not to put too fine a point on it, profoundly unpatriotic. This means that the political war now being waged in North Carolina is not only brutal, it's defining. The stakes are larger than ideological ascendancy. They touch, perhaps even permanently, the character that we seek as a people. Republican leaders don't campaign as crusaders for an altered vision of American constitutional government, but that platform is increasingly exactly what they carry out, regardless of what they say. So the political war in North Carolina is about more than politics. It's about the promises that constitute us as a commonwealth, about our constitutive assurances to one another, our hard secured traditions of governance, our character as a people. It is a core struggle then for our own decency. But this is a book about politics of North Carolina, but it's also a warning beacon, I think, for other states. The New York Times has claimed that North Carolina experienced its political cataclysm a few years ahead of the rest of the country. The Atlantic says, nowhere is the battle between liberal and conservative visions of government fiercer than in North Carolina. Vox has added, North Carolina has become the playbook for Republicans across the country. Our own congressman, also a thoughtful political scientist, David Price, argues that we've become exhibit A of our country's political trends. The nation's best election law expert has written, North Carolina set a precedent in playing a kind of hardball that we haven't seen in other places. Does it spiral out of control, he asks? It has been more asymmetric with Republicans, but I don't think it would always stay that way, he says. In other words, what's happening in Raleigh may not stay in Raleigh. Robert Kennedy said at Berkeley in 1966, the future belongs to those who can blend passion, reason, and courage in a personal commitment to the ideals and enterprises of the American democracy. What was for Kennedy a description of the world that he thought he saw unfolding around it has become for us a manifesto and a prayer. And this very month, it is a call to arms. I'll stop there. I know that was pretty long. I understand we're going to do questions and maybe do them through the chat. So I'll try and look them over and answer any questions you got as best I can. You might put them up, but it's an honor to get to talk to you, and I appreciate you hanging around for the technical difficulties. You guys got questions? I'm not showing any yet in the chat, but I hope I'm not. Okay, here we go. Sorry.
Are you seeing them, Gene?
Yeah, and now I got them. Can you tell us in more detail about restraints on voter rights in North Carolina? Sure. They have been massive and multifaceted. First of all, the federal courts have ruled that our voter ID law, which was much more than merely a provision concerning voter IDs, it regulated access to the polls and to the electoral process in a wide variety of ways. The federal courts studied it, looked at it, and said, regardless of what the claim justifications may be, we find that the North Carolina legislature, not stunning given its makeup, actually looked at all this array of ways in which the access to the ballot was regulated in North Carolina and used surgical precision. That's a very unusual term. Surgical precision to amend the voting laws in ways which would harm the electoral prospects of African Americans. So the court said this is old-fashioned, straightforward race discrimination. You can't construct your polling laws and voter ID laws in ways which are designed to hurt the participatory rights of Black people, even if you want to. So they have been declared repeatedly to be unconstitutional. Next, the federal courts looked at our redistricting on both the state and federal level and concluded that both of them were cast in ways to discriminate against African Americans. They represented massive racial gerrymandering. In fact, the federal court ruled that the racial gerrymandering which occurred in the state house was the largest, most continuing gerrymandering ever presented to a federal district court. So we have used the electoral provisions to discriminate dramatically on the basis of race. Then you know too that the legislature went back to the drawing board on both fronts, having been thwarted a little bit on racial gerrymandering, and decided to launch the most aggressive political gerrymanders ever seen in the United States. And that's, again, not my words, but the words of the federal courts. Famously, David Lewis said, I've given this extreme political gerrymander trying to cheat in favor of Republicans. I've done it to the degree I have because I don't think it's possible to do any more. That's the only thing that stopped me. So he admitted that this is as potent a network of cheating as could be contrived. The federal courts initially struck that down. Then the United States Supreme Court ruled that it was a political question, even though even the Supreme Court characterized it as an electoral outrage. But then thankfully the North Carolina state courts invalidated the political gerrymanders. So we have had a long string of cheating through the electoral process. I think it's quite clear the reason for it. I said we have an all-white caucus. The Republicans know that you can't govern North Carolina in the long run. You can't do it for another 10 years just with white people. So rather than adopting policies that might appeal to all North Carolinians, they decided to adopt electoral rules which would cheat against those who they don't favor. So thinking that they can't prevail in the electoral process in the long run unless they cheat, they've embarked upon the nation's most ambitious campaign of electoral cheating. Some of it's been invalidated, but much of it lasted for an entire decade. Conservative state courts ruled that it's so extreme that it actually severed the traditional notion of consent of the governed and rendered the legislature illegitimate as a democratic institution. So we've seen the most, well, the election law folks, the national experts say this has been the most aggressive cheating in the electoral process that's been seen in the United States, at least since the Jim Crow era. So it is not a record to be proud of unless you're proud of cheating and you disagree with the notion of American democracy. We'll look at other questions. How do we turn things around? Where is the hope? There is hope, I hope. I am one who is kind of committed to the notion of hope. When I think about hope for the future, I'm often guilty of quoting Dr. King and his notion that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, believing that we can bend this arc towards justice. I'm a big fan of Fannie Lou Hamer, who faced longer odds and said, I am going forward for freedom and justice, to be a first-class citizen. And if I happen to fall, I'll fall 5 feet 2 inches forward for freedom. Those can sound theoretical. Here's what I do believe. North Carolina, its future, its commitment to the American promise is literally on the ballot in this electoral season. It is widely understood that the same is true of our national government with the villain who is presently the President of the United States. It's less well understood that the same massive violation of our constitutional norms and traditions and checks and balances and separation of powers has been occurring even before here in North Carolina. If we do not recover the North Carolina legislature, which is the only way that those injuries will be corrected, then the long-term damage to North Carolina is, I think, unthinkable. Here's one modest hope that I have. These have been immensely difficult times, beyond trying. We have, at the same time, faced a pandemic. We face a depression following on the pandemic. And we have seen racial injustices before our eyes that no matter, though they have been in long existence, no matter how much Americans may want to hide from them, pretend that they don't exist, it is not possible to make that claim. So that one hopes we face a massive racial reckoning. When you add those three things together, here's the reality. We face a serious question looking at these dramatic chasms which are unfolding before our eyes. A serious question about whether we actually mean what we say about the meaning of America, whether we take these claims that we make, like liberty and justice for all, with seriousness or not. Here's the truth. I do a lot of work about poverty and economic inequality. The United States is by far and away the richest nation on earth. It also has, by a good measure, much more poverty and child poverty than any other advanced nation. So that we have become, whether we meant to or not, we have become, particularly in these recent decades, the richest, the poorest, and the most unequal nation in the world. Thomas Piketty, the great international inequality scholar, wrote, I guess it's 3 years ago now, that economic inequality in the United States, separation between rich and poor, is now larger, greater, more thoroughly pronounced than in any other place, in any other society, at any time in human history, anywhere in the world. We are worst forever. Now, the question is, I tell people sometimes, some people sometimes poke holes in what Piketty writes, though everyone agrees he's the most effective scholar on these matters in the world. So I don't know, maybe it's true that we're only second or third worst in human history. The gap between what we say we believe in and what we allow to transpire is larger than anywhere. So the question is, for now, are we going to put up with it? Are we going to be satisfied with being not only the most unequal, but in essence, the most hypocritical nation in the world? I see some possibility that we won't, that we will reject that. These chasms opened up to such extreme that we're going to demand change. I certainly hope so. Otherwise, we are not only the most, as I said, unequal nation in the world, but the most hypocritical one. Let me look more. It seems to me, this is Leah Mason, one of my former students, a great young lawyer. It seems that the current political climate and social media as a driver, people don't want to discuss issues. They seek reaffirmation of what they already believe in. Certainly true. In essence, that we are in camps and that it's all us against them. What do you think is the path forward to bridge those camps, to have meaningful discussions so that we can address real issues such as poverty, gender inequality, and the future of the American democracy? Well, that's a great question. It's the toughest of questions. I'm not surprised given who asked it. And I wish that I knew the answer. It is in a large part the question of the viability of our future as a decent society. It is true that we are split apart in ways that are maybe unprecedented, split apart in terms of knowledge, what we believe, what even we think the facts are, and that can be a gigantically difficult divide to overcome. I wish I knew readily how it would be overcome. I'm also not naive on it, I think. I'm not one who thinks, as I might have sometimes when I was younger, that if we just find the right words, if we find the appropriate middle ground, if we speak in tones which are sweet enough, that we'll be able to bring everyone together in kind of a kumbaya moment, and we'll not only have real discussions, but put forward real solutions and rally around them. I wish that would be true. I'm pessimistic on that front. I think the divisions are so powerful. They are so wrenching too in what they address and what they face. But to be honest, a lot of these things are not close questions. The idea of having an all-white General Assembly, 150 years after the all-white Republican caucuses of the General Assembly, 150 years after the passage of the Equal Protection Clause and its enactment, given the disparities which exist between blacks and whites in North Carolina, then followed up by efforts to disenfranchise and burden African Americans. There's not a middle ground on whether that's tenable, acceptable. Having some of the greatest economic inequality in the United States, having great wealth in our state, but also having such dramatic poverty and hunger and child poverty, child hunger. Just to remind, Greensboro and High Point have several times in the last 7 years been identified by the federal government as having the greatest hunger in the United States of any metropolitan area. Our politicians don't even talk about it. They don't even think about 6 years ago, Winston-Salem was found by the national experts to be the worst place in the United States for food insecurity of children 5 and under. The highest percentage of food insecure, hungry babies. We never talk about that. That never becomes part of our discourse. I don't think that there's a kind of middle ground to be urged on having the worst child hunger in the United States. So my own view is these problems are going to be solved, at least initially, when those of good heart and understanding participate fully and dramatically in the most astonishing of ways and badly outnumber those who seemingly don't care much about the American promise and our foundational commitments to equality. I don't think there's going to be any sweet words that solve that. I think that we're going to have to go through some changes, and those changes are going to be led principally by organizing and outnumbering. And I pray that we're successful in that. If we're not, then I fear for our commitment to what we've always said that we believe in the United States and in North Carolina. So, more questions? Are we okay? Or
well, I just popped up to say that, you know, your questions are, I mean, your answers are so very thoughtful that I think we probably have time for maybe one, possibly two more questions.
Okay. Speak to the power the legislature has over the UNC system, Board of Governors, and where you see that headed for your own institution, UNC Chapel Hill, now, and what wrongs might possibly be righted post-election. I have some experience on this front of dealing with the UNC system's Board of Governors. Fortunately, I'm old and thick-skinned and tenured, and there ain't a lot they could do to me, but it doesn't mean they haven't tried. They believe they have the right to suppress the speech of North Carolina citizens. They don't like the idea that research would be done on poverty and described. So they decided to close a poverty center that I was involved with. But we were able to reopen it and continue to do its work. They closed the Civil Rights Center. As you know, they have massively politicized university governance. They get in these fights about which one of them can be the chancellor from ECU or Western Carolina or whatever it may be. They have fired our presidents and chancellors. They have made it certain that we would not have a good candidate. Ask yourself this: if you're a nationally accomplished administrative leader, are you going to come to North Carolina to run our system or to run Chapel Hill, where you know that if you're not willing to humiliate yourself before the radical powers of the Board of Governors and Phil Berger, that you're going to be run out on a rail? It would be as stupid as going to work for Donald Trump. You know where that's going to end up. So they have done massive damage to the University of North Carolina as a whole, to Chapel Hill in particular. It has cost us a lot of faculty and cost us a lot of students, and if it continues, it will destroy what is one of the great treasures, not only of North Carolina, but the United States. It's funny, these folks tend to think that if they replace all leaders in Chapel Hill, for example, with right-wing political hacks and have them enforce their will on the academy, that the University of North Carolina will still be regarded as one of the great universities in America, and everybody's going to want to come there and their kids are going to want to come there. It doesn't work that way. If you don't believe in knowledge, you don't believe in education, you don't believe in academic freedom, you don't believe in academic rigor, you're not going to have a great university. So if we don't change the legislature, the University of North Carolina system will be one of its casualties. And it won't be long for its effectiveness and its ascendancy. They don't seem to care much about that. We are so politicized now when you think about it. I know most of tons of my colleagues in Chapel Hill. I was sort of anxious for the students to come back myself. I love teaching so much in the front of the classroom, but a lot of folks are concerned about the safety of it. And for the first time in our history, I think they thought the leaders of our campus and our system weren't going to make a decision based on the safety of students and faculty, but based on whatever it is that Phil Berger wanted, and they live in terror of pissing him off. I don't think we've had that circumstance in North Carolina before, and if we're going to keep it, then universities are going to be a casualty, just like all these other institutions which make up the quality of our lives will be as well. So I'll stop there. I'm very grateful, particularly for those of you who hung on through the technological challenges. It's marvelous to be able to talk to you, even if from a distance. And I look forward to the day that we can all go meet in McIntyre's, have a good time, and maybe even have a beer afterward.
Yes, I like that idea. You know, and I want to say thank you to everybody too for, you know, sticking it out. You know, I cannot wait to have people back in the store again. I want to have Gene here in the store, you know, and I want to have everybody, you know, I want to hear the discourse. And, you know, but this is what it is right now. And Gene, thank you so much. That was excellent. We are taping this so that, you know, we will be able to have it on our Facebook page at some point. And anybody can tune in if you've missed it. So tell your friends. And for anybody who cares, we will be getting signed copies as of Monday. We are now open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 to 5. And after Monday, we will have signed copies of Indecent Assembly. You can either go on our buy button here, wherever it is, or just come by the store. We'll have copies, and it is well worth reading. And it is very important in this day and age that we really understand all the issues. And this really is eye-opening. So please, folks, come out, get a copy, take it home, and vote with your conscience.
There you go. Right.
So, Gene, thank you very much.
Thanks
everybody. Thank you for being
everybody.
here. Take care. Come by McIntyre's. Come in and browse a little bit. Say hi. We're here, and we love seeing you. And I cannot wait to do this in person, maybe next year sometime. So, anyway, everybody, have a great day.
Thanks.
And we'll do this again sometime. Take care. Thank you, Gene.